Hey guys, welcome back to more malicious compliance Reddit stories. In this homeowner association story, imagine getting violation notices for your solar panels on land the HOA has zero authority over. When we ignored them, they tried county complaints, and when that failed, they slapped a lien on our property like we were members. That's when we decided to start a hostile takeover. Let's dive right into the story. This XXL story is titled HOA Find Me for Living Off-Grid and Solar Panels, so I bought their management company. Also, let me know in the comments what you think about these new background visuals. Do they help you stay focused on the story, or would you prefer something different? Anyway, this is going to be a long one, so make sure you stick around until the end because the payoff is absolutely worth it. If you enjoy these malicious compliance stories, please don't forget to like the video and drop a comment if you want to support the channel. My wife and I bought our property about 8 years ago in the southeast. To avoid doxing myself, I'll keep things vague on the exact location, but picture a semi-rural area where development was just starting to creep in. We found this perfect 5-acre parcel sitting on the edge of what was mostly undeveloped land. Beautiful, quiet, peaceful. Our closest neighbor was a cattle ranch about half a mile down the road, and that was exactly what we wanted. We'd been dreaming about this move for years. I had spent about 15 years in software development, climbing the corporate ladder, and I'd done well enough that we were financially comfortable. My wife is a freelance graphic designer, which meant she could work from anywhere as long as she had internet. We went with a satellite provider that works surprisingly well. The reason we chose this property wasn't random. We wanted to live off-grid. And before you picture doomsday preppers building bunkers and stockpiling canned goods, let me be clear. That's not us. We weren't preparing for the apocalypse. We were just tired of utility bills that kept climbing every year, tired of being dependent on systems we had no control over, tired of the rat race. We wanted to be self-sufficient, live sustainably, and have control over our lives. That was the dream, and this property was going to make it happen. Our setup is pretty sophisticated. We installed a solar panel array on the south-facing roof with battery storage that can keep us running for 3 days without sunlight. We drilled a well for water and set up rainwater collection as backup. For waste, we went with a composting toilet setup that's way more advanced and less gross than people imagine. We also built a gray water recycling system that filters water from sinks and shower for garden use. The house itself is a custom-built passive solar design. We worked with an architect who specialized in sustainable building, and the result is something we're genuinely proud of. It's not some ramshackle shack in the woods. This is a proper, well-built, beautiful home that we put a lot of thought and money into. The design maximizes natural heating and cooling, so our energy needs are minimal even beyond what the solar panels provide. Around the property, we've got chickens roaming in a large coop. They give us fresh eggs daily and are surprisingly low maintenance. We planted a decent-sized vegetable garden that produces more food than we can eat during growing season, so we preserve and can a lot of it. There's also a small greenhouse where we start seedlings and grow things needing controlled environment. Here's the important part. Everything is up to code and properly permitted through the county. We didn't cut corners or try to fly under the radar. We went through all proper channels when we built the house and installed our systems. We had inspections. We got permits. We did it right. We have binders full of documentation proving every single thing on our property is legal and approved. This becomes very important later. For the first few years after we moved in, life was absolutely perfect. We'd wake up to birds instead of traffic. We'd watch sunrise while collecting eggs from chickens. My wife would work in her office with windows open, listening to wind through trees. I'd spend mornings maintaining the garden and afternoons doing consulting work to keep money coming in, though we didn't need much. We were producing most of our own food. Our energy came from the sun. Our water came from the ground beneath our feet and the sky above us. We weren't paying monthly utility bills. We weren't dealing with service outages or rate hikes or any of that nonsense. We were living exactly the life we'd planned, and it was everything we'd hoped for. The peace, the quiet, the self-sufficiency, it all felt like we'd finally figured out the secret to life that everyone else was still struggling with. We'd found our paradise. But you know what they say about paradise? It never lasts. Because while we were busy living our peaceful, off-grid dream life, something was happening on the land around us. Something that was about to turn our perfect little world completely upside down and set off a chain of events that would eventually lead to one of the most satisfying cases of malicious compliance I've ever experienced. Then a developer bought the land surrounding our property on 3 sides and started building a planned community. I'm talking about rows of identical cookie-cutter houses, each one looking exactly like the next, with tiny postage stamp yards that barely had room for a lawn chair. The whole development came with all the standard suburban amenities: a community pool, a clubhouse, walking trails, decorative street lamps that all looked the same, the whole 9 yards. It was like watching suburbia get copy-pasted onto what used to be beautiful, open land. As construction progressed, they formed a homeowner association and hired a management company to run it. The development was called something pretentious like Meadow Vista Estates or Harmony Hills, or one of those generic names these places always give themselves to sound more upscale than they actually are. Here's the critical detail you need to understand. Our property was explicitly, absolutely, definitively not part of this development. We were here first. We'd been here for years before they broke ground. Our deed has no covenants, no restrictions, no HOA membership, nothing. It's completely independent. And we didn't just assume this. We checked it obsessively. I'm talking about 50+ times with our real estate attorney before the development started, during construction, and after people started moving in. Our attorney reviewed every document, checked every filing, examined every piece of paperwork related to that development. Our property is completely separate and independent from their HOA. We made absolutely certain of this because we knew developments like this could sometimes try to pull shenanigans with property boundaries and jurisdiction. We were prepared, or at least we thought we were. The development filled up pretty quickly. I guess there's always demand for affordable suburban housing, even if it means living in a house that looks exactly like everyone else's. For the first year or so after people started moving into these homes, we actually had 0 issues with our new neighbors. In fact, it was surprisingly pleasant. Some of the new residents were genuinely really nice people. They'd walk by our property on evening strolls and stop to chat with us over the fence. A few were really curious about our solar panel setup and would ask questions about how it worked, how much it cost to install, whether we really saved money in the long run. Others were fascinated by the garden and would ask for tips on growing vegetables. We'd share our extra produce with them when we had a good harvest. Zucchini, tomatoes, peppers, whatever we had too much of. It was normal, friendly neighbor stuff. The kind of interactions that make living in a community actually pleasant. We talk about the weather, share stories, laugh about random things. We honestly thought, maybe this won't be so bad. Maybe having more neighbors around would actually be nice. We were building connections with good people. Everything seemed fine. Then the HOA had their first board elections. And this is where everything started to go sideways. The guy who got himself elected as board president was, and I say this with the benefit of hindsight and extensive personal experience, one of the most insufferable human beings I have ever encountered in my entire life. Let me paint you a picture. This man was a recently retired mid-level insurance adjuster who apparently had spent his entire career shuffling papers and denying claims. And now that he was retired, he needed something to fill the massive power vacuum in his life. He'd moved into the development about 6 months before the election and had immediately, from day one, started complaining about absolutely everything. Someone's trash cans were visible from the street. Someone else's car was parked at a weird angle. The pool water was too cold. The clubhouse temperature was too warm. Nothing was ever right, and he made sure everyone knew about it. Within weeks of taking over as board president, he had assembled a crew of like-minded busybodies. You know the type. People who have nothing better to do than peek through their curtains and look for violations. People who measure their neighbor's grass with rulers. People who live for the drama and the power trip of telling others what to do. Together, they started running that HOA like it was his personal kingdom and they were his loyal subjects. His first targets were the homeowners within the development itself. It started small but escalated quickly. Fence heights were being measured with actual rulers to ensure they didn't exceed the maximum allowed height by even half an inch. Paint colors were being scrutinized against those little sample chips from the hardware store to make sure they matched the approved palette exactly. Someone got fined because their garden hose was visible from the street. Not being used inappropriately, not left out in a messy way, just visible. Another person got cited because their mailbox was the wrong shade of black. It was textbook HOA tyrant behavior, the kind of stuff you read about online and think can't possibly be real, but it was happening right in front of us. But then, inevitably, he turned his attention to us. And honestly, looking back, I think we were his white whale from the very beginning. Our property, with its visible solar panels gleaming on the roof, the raised garden beds full of vegetables, the chickens scratching around in the yard, the rainwater collection barrels, the greenhouse, all of it must have looked like an HOA president's absolute worst nightmare. And it was sitting right there at the edge of his pristine, controlled, cookie-cutter planned community. We represented everything he couldn't stand: independence, self-sufficiency, individuality, a visible rejection of suburban conformity. I think it drove him crazy that he couldn't control us, that we were living our lives on our own terms right next to his perfect little development. Every time he looked at our property, it must have been like a personal insult to him. Here he was, enforcing rules about mailbox colors and grass height, and there we were, completely outside his jurisdiction, doing whatever we wanted. Growing food, generating our own power, living off-grid, and there was nothing he could do about it. Or so we thought. Because what we didn't realize at the time was that his inability to control us wasn't going to stop him from trying. In fact, it was going to make him try even harder. And he was about to launch a campaign of harassment that would consume the next year of our lives and eventually lead to one of the most epic cases of malicious compliance I could have ever imagined. The first notice showed up in our mailbox on a Tuesday morning. It was from their management company, Community Services Incorporated, and it was one of those official-looking letters printed on fancy letterhead with all the legal jargon. The notice informed us that our solar panel installation was in violation of community aesthetic guidelines and needed to be removed or screened from view within 30 days. And there, at the bottom, was a $50 fine attached to it like it was already decided. I read it, my wife read it, we both looked at each other, laughed, and threw it straight into the trash. I mean, come on. Our property isn't part of their HOA. We don't have to follow their aesthetic guidelines. This was clearly just some administrative error, right? Someone probably got our address mixed up with an actual HOA member. It would sort itself out. The second notice came 2 weeks later. This one was about our chickens. Apparently, livestock was prohibited within the community boundaries, and our chickens were in violation of this policy. Another $50 fine. We threw that one away too, though I'll admit, we were starting to get a little annoyed. Like, how hard is it to check property records before sending out violation notices? Then notices 3, 4, and 5 arrived over the next month. Each one targeting a different aspect of our off-grid setup. Our compost bins were apparently a health hazard that could attract pests and create unsanitary conditions. Our rainwater collection barrels were an eyesore that detracted from the visual harmony of the neighborhood. Our greenhouse was an unauthorized structure that had been erected without HOA approval, and each notice came with escalating fines. $75, $100, $150. They were treating this like we actually owed them money, like they had some kind of authority over our property. It was absurd. But here's the thing, and I want to mention this quickly because the original poster wanted to stay anonymous. I changed all the currency amounts to US dollars for easier understanding and to protect their identity. They were using local currency in their original story, which kind of defeats the purpose of staying anonymous, but anyway, let's get back to the story. After the 5th violation notice, I finally decided it was time to actually respond instead of just throwing these things away. I sat down and wrote a very polite, very professional letter explaining the situation. I laid out the facts clearly. Our property was not part of the HOA, we had no covenant obligations whatsoever, and we would really appreciate it if they would stop sending us these violation notices because they had no legal basis. To make absolutely sure there was no confusion, I included a copy of our property deed showing our parcel numbers and boundaries. I highlighted all the relevant sections in yellow so they couldn't possibly miss it. I attached a survey map showing exactly where our property line ended and where the HOA development began. I made it crystal clear that there was no overlap, no ambiguity, no gray area. Our property was separate. Period. I printed out 2 copies, put them in envelopes, and mailed them certified mail with return receipt requested. One went to the HOA board directly. The other went to Community Services Incorporated, the management company that had been sending us all these notices. I wanted documentation that they had received this information that they couldn't claim later they didn't know. About a week later, I got a response. But it wasn't a letter. It wasn't a phone call. It wasn't even an email. The response was the HOA board president himself showing up at our front gate unannounced. I saw his car pull up, watched him get out, and I could already tell from his body language that this wasn't going to be a friendly conversation. I walked out to meet him at the gate, and I tried to keep an open mind. Maybe he was coming to apologize. Maybe he was coming to explain that there had been a mistake and they'd stop sending the notices. The first thing out of his mouth when I reached the gate was, "So, you're the ones bringing down property values around here, huh?" Not hello. Not an introduction. Just an immediate accusation delivered with this smug smile on his face like he'd already won some kind of argument we weren't even having yet. I took a deep breath and kept my cool. I explained, very calmly, that our property had been here before his development even existed. We weren't bringing down anything. We were here first. And more importantly, we were not part of his HOA. I told him I'd sent documentation proving this to both the board and the management company. You know what he did? He actually laughed. Like, full-on laughed in my face. Then he said something along the lines of, "That's what everyone says until they get the bill. The covenants run with the land around here. Your property is surrounded by ours on 3 sides, so it falls under our jurisdiction whether you like it or not. You will comply with our community standards one way or another, sooner or later." Famous. But words. Little did this guy know that I would indeed comply with his precious community standards at some point. Just in a totally different way than he expected. In a way that he couldn't possibly have seen coming. But we're not there yet in the story. And by the way, guys, please don't forget to watch this entire video until the end because this is really an XXL story and you absolutely do not want to miss how this ends. Trust me, the payoff is worth it. Either way, if you're enjoying these malicious compliance stories so far, please don't forget to like the video and post a comment if you want to support the channel. Your engagement really does help. Anyway, back to the confrontation. What the president was claiming was, of course, completely false. That's not how covenants work. That's not how property law works. That's not how any of this works. You can't just claim jurisdiction over someone else's property because it happens to be near yours. I told him exactly that. I explained that he was wrong, that his understanding of property law was completely incorrect, and that he had no authority over our land. His face started turning red. You could see his jaw clenching. He clearly wasn't used to people standing up to him or contradicting him. In his little HOA kingdom, what he said was law, and people just obeyed. But we weren't part of his kingdom, and I wasn't going to obey. He pointed his finger at me and said, through gritted teeth, "You'll be hearing from our attorney." Then he turned around, got back in his car, and drove off without another word. As I watched him leave, I remember thinking that this situation was probably going to get worse before it got better. I had no idea just how right I was. Over the next few months, things escalated in ways I couldn't have imagined. The violation notices didn't stop. In fact, they increased. They were coming at a rate of about 2 per week now, each one more ridiculous than the last, and the fines kept climbing higher and higher. It was clear that our attempt at reasonable communication had failed spectacularly, and the HOA board president had decided to double down on his campaign against us. Over the next few months, things got ugly. Really ugly. The violation notices kept coming like clockwork, now at a rate of about 2 per week. Every time I checked the mailbox, there was another one waiting for us. The solar panels, the chickens, the compost, the rainwater barrels, the greenhouse. They'd already sent notices about all of these things, but now they were sending duplicate notices, claiming we hadn't responded or taken corrective action. The fines kept climbing too. They'd gone from $50 to $75 to $100, And now they were hitting us with $200 fines for the same violations they'd already cited. Then we got a past due invoice. I'm not kidding. An actual invoice, printed on official letterhead with line items and everything. Solar panel violation, $400. Livestock violation, $350. Unauthorized structures, $500. It went on and on. The total was over $4,000. $4,000 for violations we'd never committed on property they had no authority over. We ignored it. We threw it in the same drawer where we'd been filing all their ridiculous notices. A few weeks after that, we got a letter from an attorney. Not our attorney. Their attorney. It was one of those legal threat letters written in that intimidating lawyer language designed to scare people into compliance. The letter threatened legal action if we didn't immediately pay the accumulated fines and bring our property into compliance with community standards. It gave us 14 days to respond. That's when my wife and I decided we needed to lawyer up properly. We hired our own attorney, and she was fantastic. She reviewed everything, all the notices, all the documentation, our property deed, the HOA bylaws, all of it. Then she drafted a cease and desist letter that laid everything out in crystal clear legal terms. Our attorney's letter was thorough and professional. It explained that our property was not subject to the HOA's authority, that all the fines they'd issued were completely illegitimate, and that if they continued this pattern of harassment, we would pursue legal action against them. We thought that would be the end of it. Surely once their attorney saw our documentation, they'd realize they had no case and back off. We were wrong. The HOA didn't back down. Instead, they got creative. And by creative, I mean they started playing dirty. They filed complaints with the County Code Enforcement Office. Multiple complaints, actually. They claimed we had unpermitted structures on our property. They alleged health code violations from our composting system. They sent anonymous reports claiming concerned neighbors had seen us doing construction without permits. It was all completely false, but the county had to investigate every complaint. A county inspector showed up at our property on a Thursday morning. Nice guy, actually. He seemed annoyed that he had to be there. We showed him around. Showed him all our permits, all our documentation, all the approval letters from when we'd built everything. He inspected the solar panels, the well, the compost system, the greenhouse, everything. He took notes, took some photos, and then told us we were fine. Everything was properly permitted. Everything was up to code. 0 violations found. He even made a comment as he was leaving. He said, "Somebody's really got it out for you folks." This is the 3rd bogus complaint I've responded to this month in this area. But the HOA wasn't done. They tried another tactic. They filed a claim with the county about our property being a nuisance. They alleged that our chickens created excessive noise that disturbed the peaceful enjoyment of the neighborhood. They claimed there were odor complaints from our compost bins. They said neighbors were complaining but were too afraid to come forward. All lies. Another county inspector came out. This one specialized in nuisance complaints. He spent an hour on our property, listening to our chickens, which were quieter than most of the dogs in the neighborhood. He checked our compost system, which was properly maintained and had 0 odor issues. He talked to us, looked at our setup, and concluded there were no violations. He told us the same thing the first inspector had said. Someone was filing false complaints, and the county was getting tired of wasting resources on them. We thought maybe that would be the end of it. Maybe the HOA would finally realize they couldn't win this fight and would leave us alone. But then they crossed a line. A serious line. They filed a lien against our property. A lien. On our property. Claiming we owed them $8,500 in unpaid fines and fees. Let me explain what this means for anyone who doesn't know. A property lien is a legal claim against your property. It goes on public record. It clouds your title, which means if you try to sell your property or refinance your mortgage, that lien has to be dealt with first. It essentially puts a legal claim on your property saying you owe someone money, and it stays there until it's resolved or removed by a court. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was financial warfare. They were trying to mess with our property rights, our ability to do anything with our own land. This was the moment I decided enough was enough. We weren't going to just defend ourselves anymore. We were going on offense. Our attorney immediately filed a motion in court to remove the lien. She argued, correctly, that the HOA had absolutely no authority over our property, that the fines were fraudulent, and that the lien was illegally placed. She included all our documentation: property deed, survey maps, the county inspection reports showing no violations, expert testimony about covenant law, everything. We had a mountain of evidence on our side. The court scheduled a hearing. The HOA board president showed up with their attorney and their management company representative. He looked confident. He actually looked confident, like he thought he was going to win. He had this smug expression on his face like he'd finally gotten us where he wanted us. The hearing didn't go the way he expected. Our attorney presented our case methodically. She showed the property deed. She showed the survey maps. She showed the timeline of harassment. She showed the county inspector reports. She presented expert testimony from a real estate attorney about how covenants and HOA jurisdiction actually works. It was airtight. The judge was not impressed with the HOA. Not at all. He asked their attorney directly why they were trying to assert authority over property that clearly wasn't part of their association. The HOA attorney fumbled through some explanation about community standards and aesthetic harmony and surrounding properties. The judge cut him off. The ruling was decisive. The lien was improper and had to be removed immediately. The HOA was ordered to pay our legal fees. And the judge gave them a very clear warning about continuing to harass us. It felt like a victory. We won. We'd beaten them in court. But here's the thing. The board president didn't see this as a defeat. He saw it as a temporary setback. The violation notices slowed down after the court ruling, but they didn't stop completely. And I realized that no matter how many times we beat them in court, this guy wasn't going to give up. We needed a permanent solution. We needed something that would end this once and for all. So I started doing research. I started looking into the HOA, into their management company, into how all of this actually worked. And that's when I discovered something very, very interesting. Something that was going to change everything. So I started digging. I mean, really digging. I wanted to understand everything about how this HOA operated, who ran it, and most importantly, who was behind that management company that kept sending us all these violation notices. Community Services Incorporated. I started researching them online, looking up business records, checking reviews, everything I could find. What I discovered was fascinating. Community Services Incorporated was a small, locally owned operation. They weren't some big national HOA management firm. They managed only about 4 or 5 HOAs in our area, and our HOA was one of their larger clients. The company had been around for about 15 years, and from what I could tell from online reviews and Better Business Bureau complaints, they weren't particularly well run. Lots of complaints about poor communication, slow response times, and inconsistent enforcement of rules. But here's the interesting part. The owner was looking to retire. I found a listing on a business for sale website. The management company was actually on the market. The listing had been up for about 8 months with no serious buyers. The asking price was listed, and while it wasn't cheap, it was within reach. Remember, I'd spent 15 years in software development and had done pretty well financially. My wife and I had savings. We could actually afford this. I sat there staring at that listing for probably an hour, just thinking through the implications. What if we bought it? What if we actually purchased the management company that was managing the HOA that had been harassing us? The irony was almost too perfect. The HOA board president had told me I would comply with their community standards one way or another. Well, if we owned the management company, we wouldn't just comply. We'd be setting the standards. We'd be running the whole operation. I called the business broker the next morning. That evening, I sat down with my wife and laid out the whole idea. Buy the management company. Take control of the HOA's operations from the inside. She thought I was crazy at first, and honestly, I couldn't blame her. It was a crazy idea. But the more we talked about it, the more it made sense. There were definite pros to this plan. First and most important, we'd have direct control over the HOA's operations. We could ensure they never harassed us again. We could make sure they operated properly and legally. Second, it was actually a decent business opportunity. Despite the management company's problems, it was generating steady revenue. With some improvements and proper management, it could be profitable. Third, and this became more important to me as I thought about it, we could actually help the other homeowners in that development. From everything I'd seen, the board president was abusing his power, and the homeowners were suffering for it. We could change that. Of course, there were cons too. It would be a significant financial investment. It would take up a lot of our time. We'd have to actually run this business and deal with other HOAs, not just the one harassing us. And there was always the risk that the board president would retaliate somehow when he found out. We talked about it for hours. We made lists. We ran numbers. We discussed scenarios. And finally, we made our decision. We were going to do it. We were going to buy that management company. It was the perfect malicious compliance. The board president had told me I'd comply with community standards one way or another. Well, I was going to comply all right, by becoming the person who set those standards. I contacted the business broker and arranged a meeting with the current owner. He was a guy in his late 60s who'd been running the company for years and just wanted to retire and spend time with his grandkids. When we met, he was incredibly relieved to have a serious buyer. He'd been trying to sell for months with no luck. We talked about the business, the clients, the operations. And then I mentioned which HOA I lived near. His face changed. He actually groaned. He said, "Oh, you're dealing with that board president. I'm so sorry. He's the worst client I've ever had in 15 years of doing this." He told me stories. Apparently, the board president called him constantly, demanding immediate action on violations, insisting on sending out notices that the management company knew had no legal basis. The owner said his staff had repeatedly advised against sending us those violation notices. They'd told the board president multiple times that our property wasn't under HOA jurisdiction, but the president had overruled them every single time, threatening to fire the management company if they didn't comply with his demands. This was gold. This meant there was documentation, internal communications showing that the management company had warned against this course of action. Evidence that the board president had been acting against professional advice. I kept my face neutral, but inside I was celebrating. We negotiated for a few weeks, did our due diligence, reviewed the contracts, looked at the financials, went through everything with a lawyer and an accountant. The business was sound. It just needed better management and better boundaries with difficult clients like our HOA board president. We settled on a price, arranged financing, and signed the papers. I officially became the owner of Community Services Incorporated. The HOA that had been harassing us for months was now my client. The board president who'd been making our lives miserable was now, technically, my customer. The irony was delicious. For the first few weeks, I didn't make any dramatic changes. I wanted to learn the business, understand the operations, meet the staff. I reviewed all the HOA contracts, including the one with our HOA. And that's when I found something beautiful. The contract that the board president had signed 3 years ago had some very interesting terms. It was a 3-year contract with an automatic renewal clause. It could only be terminated with 18 months' notice. And there was a termination fee equal to 2 full years of management fees. The board president had locked his HOA into an expensive, long-term contract that was nearly impossible to get out of. He'd signed it himself. I also reviewed all the internal communications about our property. Every email, every memo, every note. The management company staff had documented everything. They'd advised against every single violation notice. They'd warned it was legally risky. They'd recommended consulting with an attorney before proceeding. The board president had ignored all of it and demanded they send the notices anyway. It was all there in writing. The annual HOA meeting was coming up in about a month. This was the meeting where the board presented financial reports to all the homeowners, discussed the budget, addressed concerns. Attendance was usually pretty good because it was one of the few times homeowners got to see where their dues were actually going. I decided this would be the perfect time to make my presence known. I prepared a detailed presentation, real financial information about what the HOA had been spending money on, comparisons showing they were paying significantly more for management services than comparable HOAs in the area. Documentation of all the legal fees they'd racked up from their harassment campaign against us. The night of the meeting, I showed up as a representative of Community Services Incorporated. There were over 30 homeowners in attendance, packed into the clubhouse. The board president was running the meeting, going through his usual boring agenda items. When it came time for the financial report, he started glossing over the numbers quickly, clearly trying to move past it without much discussion. I stood up. I introduced myself as the new owner of Community Services Incorporated. The room went quiet. People were confused about who I was. But the board president's face went white, then red, then kind of purple. He knew exactly who I was. I asked if I could present some additional financial information that the homeowners might find interesting. The president tried to say no, tried to shut it down, but other homeowners were curious now. They wanted to hear what I had to say. Someone made a motion to allow me to present. It was seconded. The president was outvoted. I pulled up my presentation on the screen. I showed them the real numbers. I showed them how much they were paying compared to other HOAs. I showed them the legal fees from the harassment campaign against our property. I showed them the internal communications where the management company had repeatedly advised against sending those violation notices and how the board president had overruled them every time. I showed them documentation of everything. The room erupted. Homeowners were furious, but not at me. They were furious at the board. I could see the anger spreading through the crowd. People were turning to each other with shocked expressions. Someone in the back started asking questions out loud. Why were they paying so much? Where was all this money going? A woman stood up and said she'd been wondering where her dues were going since the pool had been broken for 6 months and nobody could give her a straight answer about when it would be fixed. A guy in the back demanded to know why the community landscaping looked terrible when they were apparently paying thousands to a landscape consulting firm. His lawn had more brown patches than green ones. Another homeowner wanted to know why the clubhouse was always booked for board functions when residents couldn't reserve it. She tried to book it for her daughter's birthday and was told it wasn't available for 3 months straight. The board president tried to defend himself. He called me a fraud. He said I'd bought the management company specifically to sabotage the HOA. He said he was going to fire us immediately. I stayed calm. I pulled out the management contract and read the termination clause out loud. 18 months notice required. Termination fee equal to 2 years of management fees. The HOA couldn't afford to fire me even if they wanted to. You signed this contract, I said quietly. I'm just honoring it. His face went through several shades of color I didn't know were possible on human skin. One of the other board members, who seemed genuinely unaware of most of what had been happening, turned to him and asked, "Did you actually sign a contract with those terms?" The president started yelling. He said this was a setup, that I was trying to destroy the community, that none of this was legal. Someone in the back yelled, "If it's not legal, then sue him." Oh wait, you already tried that and lost. The meeting completely fell apart after that. Multiple homeowners called for a vote of no confidence. Under the HOA's own bylaws, a majority vote of homeowners present at a general meeting could call for a special election to replace board members. That night, with over 30 homeowners present, they voted overwhelmingly to remove the board president and 2 of his closest allies. The vote wasn't even close. 28-4. The board president stormed out, yelling that he was going to sue everyone. His wife was waiting in the parking lot. We could hear her asking what happened, and his response was just incoherent, angry sputtering. Over the following weeks, I worked with the new interim board to conduct a full financial reconciliation. We identified over $42,000 in questionable expenditures. Things like the landscape consulting company that turned out to be the former president's brother-in-law, excessive legal fees, unexplained charges. The new board voted to pursue recovery of those funds. The former president hired a lawyer, but once his attorney actually looked at the documentation, he apparently recommended settling quickly and quietly. They settled. The former president repaid about half, and the other former board members covered the rest. The president sold his house a few months later and moved away. The new board dropped the brother-in-law's landscape company and hired an actual professional landscaping service at half the cost. The grounds started looking better within a month. The pool got fixed within 2 weeks. It was just a simple pump replacement that should have been handled months earlier. The clubhouse was opened up for all residents. Real community events started happening. Many homeowners actually thanked me, not just for exposing the financial problems, but for standing up to the board in the first place. Several told me they'd been afraid to push back because the president had a reputation for retaliating. The new board passed a formal resolution acknowledging our property wasn't part of the HOA and that no violation notices would ever be issued to us again. All outstanding fines were voided. Not that they were ever valid anyway. I ran the management company for about a year. It turned out to be a decent business once I cleaned it up. I improved processes, gave the staff raises because they were underpaid, and focused on actually serving the HOAs well instead of just collecting fees. When I was ready to step away, I sold it to one of the compliance officers who'd been eager to move into management. He's doing a great job with it. The HOA board is actually great now too. They focus on things that actually matter: maintaining common areas, organizing events, keeping finances transparent. So yeah guys, let me know in the comments. If you were in my shoes, would you have kept running the management company, or would you have tried to shut down the HOA entirely? And also, where are you watching from today? Thanks for sticking with this story all the way to the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.